From isolated communities to large-scale industrial operations, the environment of Estonian glassworkers certainly differed, but most of them belonged to the migrant community. My name is Monika Repo, and today I will be presenting my paper focusing on previously unstudied patterns of interregional movement and life histories of migrant glassworkers in 17th to 19th century Estonia. This study is part of my PhD project, which I have been carrying out since 2017, using archaeological finds, contemporary accounts, church books, grave records, maps, and other relevant archival data to study the production and consumption of glass in Estonia. Estonia is situated in northeast Europe, and it was colonized in the Livonian Crusades. From 1227 until 1918, when Estonia gained independence, it had a number of rulers. All of these rulers had a different influence on the local demographic and history. Most importantly, the Middle Low German-speaking minority established themselves as the ruling class from the conquest onwards and forced the locals into serfdom. Access to skilled positions was also regulated by the Baltic Germans, often completely denying it to locals. Due to these regulations, locals were not allowed to hold skilled positions at glassworks, resulting in a wholly migrant-led industry, which operated in this way from the early 17th century and well into the 19th, and on occasion even into the 20th century. Most of the studies regarding glassworkers in Estonia are either contemporaneous accounts or extensive studies in genealogy. There has been no distinct research agenda, but studies on Hüti, Ruikamäleski, and the Kärevere region stand out. All three appear in 18th to 19th century descriptions of the industry and the life of the workers. A brilliant example of an early interdisciplinary study combining archaeology and archival studies comes from 1966, written by Max Roosma. He was a glass artist who excavated the first known glassworks in Estonia, Hüti. Later, he worked on various other glassworking sites. His work was followed up only over 40 years later by Andres Tvauri, although Tvauri's focus was on building remains and production waste. In terms of genealogy, the most important and unrivaled study is the unpublished genealogical research by Laeva glass factory owner Robert Feldman. His research was rediscovered in 2008, and historian Dirk Erbenbeck combined some of Feldman's materials with his own extensive study on 18th century glassworkers in the Baltics. In total, there have been at least 40 local glassmaking factories on the territory of modern-day Estonia from 1628 until the 1950s. The list you see here is the first revised list of the glassworks since 1969. Several of these operated over 100 years, resulting in a constant demand for skilled foreign workers. As we can see from here, the 18th century was a time of a significant increase in the number of operational glassworks. Instead of 2 operating glassworks like in the first half of the century, there were now 18. The demand for glassworkers rose sharply and remained high due to the size of the newer glassworks. Nearly 900 individuals who worked in the industry or were closely related to a worker, that is, a sibling, a spouse, etc., have been recorded as part of the study as of date. August Wilhelm Huppel, an 18th century writer, noted that the foreign glassmakers are mainly from Mecklenburg in Germany, with the occasional local German learning the trade from them. Could this be true? Where did the workers come from? Until the end of the 18th century, the workers were sourced by middlemen, so-called agents, stationed at the largest harbor towns in Europe, like Lübeck and Rostock. Secondary migration or family reunification is also of note. On occasion, the master personally traveled to find workers. The master at Hüti, Paul Gavgunker, planned to go to Poland, probably Danzig, for this very same reason in 1641. The workers could also travel to a factory with an incoming master, which happened in 1794 in Meleski, when Anton Amelung and his workers arrived from Grünenplan, Germany. Lower Saxony, where Grünenplan is situated, was another area where the workers came from apart from Mecklenburg. Here we also see some of the places of origin for the foreign workers. For many, however, the origin is not very clearly listed. We only know the country they came from. Shortage of workers was not uncommon even after the guild-based division of skilled professions was eradicated in the governorates of Livonia and Estonia in 1785, allowing access to locals to these trades. The locals still had limited freedom of movement and were obliged to pay tithes, binding them to their masters. Only by 1819, serfdom was de jure abolished in both Livonia and Estonia, but de facto, the locals still had responsibilities to their landowners, and the industry continued to rely on foreign workers. For example, at Raames, Estonians had only been polishers since the beginning of the 19th century, but were reconsidered as potential workforce for actual glassmaking in 1841. Despite the long journey to get here, it seems that the glassworkers did not stay in one place for too long. From the workers with known movements, an average of 1 to 3 years at a single glassworking site in Estonia could be calculated. The busiest period was in the middle and second half of the 18th century. At the other end of the spectrum are workers who stay at the same glassworker for 13-14 years. For example, the apprentices at Huti stayed in one place for a relatively long time. The interregional migration of workers looking for better conditions did pose a problem to the owners of the glassworks. At Korodionka, the management of the estate tried to indebt the workers by providing cheap liquor on a tab. Driving the workers to debt was unfortunately common practice to avoid them leaving. Here is an example of interregional movement in the middle of the 18th century. It is unclear where Christian Beck was born, but he did take advantage of vacancies in the growing industry. He ended up marrying Engel Lovisa Stichkorn, the daughter of a Bohemian glassmaker at Altnurga, then called Talkov. Their son Johann was born there and later became a glassworker himself at Kärevere and Rekka. Christian moved to Korodionka, and although we don't know whether Lovisa moved there with him, they both appear in Napo in the 1770s. Using written and material records, we can observe the life stories of migrant glassworkers in Estonia from birth to old age. Unfortunately, the homes of glassworkers have received almost no attention archaeologically, as the focus has been on the concrete area of production. A lack of sources and historically perhaps interest to properly assess the location of glassworkers' lodgings in regards to the production sites means that the archaeological study of the daily life of Estonian glassworkers and their families is very complicated. Here we see some of the personal items that have been discovered from the only archaeological excavations of a 17th century glassworking site in Estonia. The finds include pipkins, red glazeware, and coins and knives, as already seen. Perhaps surprisingly, there are much fewer finds related to everyday life from 18th and 19th century sites. This could indicate a stronger division between working and living areas. Here are the finds from 3 excavations carried out by Andres Tvauri on Laasmäe, Utsali, and Laashane glassworks. The porcelain is local, produced at Põltsamaa, 30 kilometers north from the glassworks. Unfortunately, there aren't many more finds apart from these. However, we do know that the glassworkers were provided with sheep, cows, and oxen in the 17th century. Similarly, at Raames, a family of German workers was given 2 cows and a garden plot in the 19th century, but apparently this was unsatisfactory for many. The living conditions of German skilled workers were considered better than for local workers or Russian obrok peasants. That being said, the workers that moved here from Grünenplan faced serious hardships as the planned houses for the workers were not completed in time for winter. Apparently, the newly appointed director master lived in a floorless, ovenless hut with his 2 sons all winter. We also know that just before this, there was a serious malaria outbreak in Estonia, and as the new glass factory had been built essentially in a swamp, it struck the new arrivals hard. The outbreak lasted for a few years. Although the conditions were rough at first, at least for those at Raames, the fact that the master endured the same difficulties with them ended up being extremely beneficial. It bonded the workers even further, and they looked up to their overseer. Migrant workers moved to Estonia with their families, but also started families here. Unfortunately, we have no archaeological data for the presence of children at glassworking sites for the reasons just stated. However, written records offer many more clues. The most interesting aspect discovered during the study was the role of the godparents in the children's lives. Generally, they had 3 godparents or witnesses when they were christened. For baby boys in the study, the first listed godparent was often a person who ranked socially highest from the 3. A pastor, headmaster, classmaster, and so on. They tended to be men, but women were not rare either. For baby girls, it was a married or widowed woman who also had a high social standing. The next 2 for either could be married or unmarried men and women of any social status, generally closely connected to the family. The children were given their godparents' forenames, so all 3 had a very visible impact on the children's lives. This also makes non-Estonian children stand out in church registers, as Estonian children generally had 1 and only, on occasion from the early 20th century onwards, 2 forenames. Despite a lack of material records for the presence of children at Estonian glassworks, according to economic historian Otto Karma, children were employed in taking products to the annealing furnaces and in packing. But they also had to go to school. In the early 19th century, 2 German schools were opened by the Euroopa and Mälesti glassworks. This indicates that the obligation for 7 to 12-year-olds to attend school and receive a formal education probably extended to the migrant children as well. Unfortunately, some children remain children forever. When comparing the glassworks, the infant and child mortality rates are higher in Vändra and Lelle than elsewhere. This could be down to data bias in Feldman's records, as there is more data for Vändra and Lelle. Sadly, I was unable to find details in the digital database for graveyards about the preserved graves or grave markers for these children in the study. From the 17th century onwards, we see pre-teens, 13, 14-year-olds starting out as stokers and apprentices. Hytti and the smaller 18th century glassworks were similar in size, employing up to a dozen skilled workers and many more unskilled workers. Most glassworks produced both flat and vessel glass, and generally these parts of the production were headed by separate masters. However, with the arrival of the 20 working families from Grünenplan mentioned earlier in the 1790s, the industry was transformed. In 1822, Riika Meleski employed already 508 individuals. By 1850, 800 individuals. Glassworks with 20 or 40 workers did continue operating, but several glassworks were joined later on, causing further interregional movements. From the middle of the century, the production process started to change, and the number of foreign workers started to decline as locals began to be utilized in more skilled positions. Life was not all rosy at the glassworks. Once the workers had settled in, work was hard, the furnaces were on 24/7, in several places work was undertaken also on Sundays, and glassworkers could be punished for a number of offenses by whipping, similarly to the serfs. At Riika Meleski, this was the punishment for stealing or brawling. They could also be fined for stopping the machines when they were drunk. The glassworks also sprouted non-working relationships, as shown with godparenting. In many cases, the younger male workers married the daughters of the older workers. Most surprisingly, however, there were multiple accounts of non-monogamy and adultery at Hytti in the 17th century. The glassworkers truly lived fascinating lives. To allow further analysis, the data presented here will be published as 3 open access raw data sets under a CC BY license in the Data.doi repository hosted by the University of Tartu Library in autumn 2021. This study has been supported by the Society for Post-Medieval Archaeology. Thank you.